The first time she collapsed, he thought she had died. The heat was brutal, the twin suns beating down like hammers, and the sand stung like teeth in the wind. He had wrapped her in the last of his cooling cloth, shielding her fragile body from the worst of it. But she was not built for this place, not for the salt flats, or the cracked plains, or the toxic storms that swept through without warning. He dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to her chest, and waited his own breath shallow, until he heard the faint thrum of her second heart still beating slow, but steady. She was alive. Again. He picked her up, cradled her like something holy, and continued walking. They had been running for 2 days now, and she had not spoken since the shuttle crashed. Her crown was gone, her armor cracked, her eyes fevered, but she still held on to the crystal core, the last piece of her broken throne. And the thing that made her a target. The assassins would come for it and for her, and they would not stop until both were ashes. He had not meant to be her guardian. He was just a scout passing through higher to chart the edge of the red deadlands where maps turned to myths and coordinates dissolved in heat. But when the explosion lit the sky, and he found her crawling from a wreckage burned and regal and still alive, he had made a choice. He did not understand her words, but he understood her fear and her pain and the desperation in her eyes when she reached out and touched his hand. So he carried her. Through sand that hissed underfoot and sky that cracked with storms, he walked with her arms limp around his shoulders, her breath warming the back of his neck, her whispers soft and broken. On the third day, they reached the skeletons of ancient Ashine's metal giants, long dead, half buried, in dunes, their corpses cooling shade and shelter from the worst of the sun. He laid her there, gave her the last of his water, and tore cloth from his shirt to filter dust from her mouth. She opened her eyes, once reached up and touched his face, and whispered a word that sounded like thank you. That night, he dreamed of her, not as she was now, but whole radiant, her skin gleaming, her voice like song, and her gaze full of fire and command. And she said to him, "You are the only one who did not kneel." He woke to find her sitting up, her hand on his rifle, and her gaze locked on the ridge where 3 shadows waited. They moved like smoke, swift and sure, blades glinting in the moonlight, and no word spoken. The assassins. He grabbed the rifle, she took the blade from his belt, and they stood together back to back. The fight was brutal. Fast one assassin felt her strike another to his shot, but the third vanished into the dark, leaving only silence behind, and a long slash across her side. She bled gold. He tore strips from his jacket, wrapped the wound, held her as she trembled, and said, "You cannot die, not yet." She smiled and weak but real, and whispered, "Not until I see the sea." He did not know what sea she meant, but he nodded and carried her again. On the 4th day, the winds rose to screaming, and the earth cracked beneath their feet, and they stumbled into a canyon where the rocks sang with strange echoes, and the air shimmered with old energy. She began to hum a tune that made the stones quiet, and he realized she was not just royalty. She was something older, something deeper, her blood tied to this land in a way he would never understand. But he did not need to understand. He only needed to keep moving. That night, they found a pool hidden in the rocks glowing with soft light, and he bathed her, gently washing away the blood and sand and fear, and she opened her eyes and whispered, "My name is Avesh." He held her hand and said, "Mine is Kalen," and she repeated it like a vow. They slept curled together under a crumbling arch her head against his chest, her breath sinking with his, and for the first time he felt not like a fugitive or fool, but like someone chosen. On the 5th day, they reached the ridge. Below them stretched the sea, not of water, but a glass endless and shining with every color of the dusk, and she gasped and clutched his arm and whispered, "My home." He smiled and said, "Then let us finish this." But the final assassin waited, a figure of black light and shifting blades that stepped from a rock like a shadow given breath, and pointed a blade at her heart. He stepped in front of her, weapon raised, and shouted, "You will not have her." The assassin laughed a sound like broken metal, and said, "You are nothing. Then try me." The fight was different this time, slower, heavier, each blow shaking the ground, each strike burning with meaning. He fought not to kill, but to protect, and the assassin fought with the fury of 1,000 dead odes. In the end, it was her who ended it. She rose bloodied and shaking and drove the crystal core into the assassin's chest, whispering an ancient word, and the shadow screamed and vanished into dust. She fell then into his arms and said, "You have done what no other did." He held her close and said, "Then let me carry you home." They crossed the last stretch together, her leaning on him, her steps slow but certain, and when they reached the sea, her people were there waiting their ships like silver wings, their eyes wide with wonder. They called her name, and she stood tall though shaking, and said, "This is the one who carried me through death." They bowed to him, and she turned to him one last time, and said, "You saved more than a queen. You saved me,